the harsh winter of 1883. Deep in the snow-choked hollows of West Virginia, a quiet religious settlement faced something that would shake its faith to the core and blur the line between belief, reason, and the strange mind of a child named Elias Dorn. He was only 9 when he rose during Sunday service at Briar Hollow's Presbyterian Chapel, speaking in a tone that didn't sound like his own. His words were strange. He spoke of blood in stone, of crows crying warnings, and of 19 souls who would be saved from the coming darkness. 3 days later, a coal shaft near the industrial town of Marlow collapsed. 27 miners died, but exactly 19 were pulled out alive. Authorities buried the story, afraid of hysteria and lawsuits, but in 1971, a trunk unearthed during a Charleston demolition revealed journals, sermons, and medical notes describing what had happened. A child had predicted the disaster to the minute, down to the number of survivors. Historians, doctors, and theologians have studied it for decades and still can't explain it. Elias's strange visions were documented by more than 50 witnesses, clergy, a traveling doctor, even a U.S. Marshal, whose report was quietly sealed in state archives. This isn't a ghost story. It's a piece of history the world wasn't ready to face. If you're still here, you're not like most people. Most turn away when history gets uncomfortable, but not here. Here we uncover the forgotten corners of America where faith and fear collide. So, if you're ready to follow us into the shadows of Briar Hollow, subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. You might want to keep a light on for this one. Because this story doesn't start with Elias's prophecy. It begins with a forgotten trail, a murdered family, and a choice that would haunt one man forever. Briar Hollow wasn't on any map. Even for Appalachia, it was isolated, a cluster of cabins strung along a narrow ridgeline where the mountains pressed together like hands in prayer. The only road was barely wide enough for a wagon, and once the first snow fell, no one expected visitors until spring. The community was founded in 1869 by Reverend Abel Pike, a former Union chaplain who led a small group of Presbyterians west in search of something purer than what they'd left behind. They built their church first, then homes, a schoolhouse, and a small infirmary. They lived simply, trusting in faith and one another. Among them were Silas and Miriam Dorn, he a quiet blacksmith, she a midwife, whose hands always smelled faintly of lavender. For years they tried to have children, losing 3 pregnancies and 1 stillbirth. The townsfolk whispered their condolences and moved on. So when Silas came home from a spring hunt in 1874, carrying a bundled child, no one asked too many questions. He said he'd found the boy abandoned near an old trail marker. In the mountains, such stories weren't rare, and in Briar Hollow, every child was a gift from God. What Silas didn't tell anyone was what he'd really found. Deep in the western woods beyond the foothills, he'd come upon a burned encampment, 3 huts reduced to ash. The air heavy with gunpowder and blood. It was the remains of a Monongahela band, one of the last, who refused to leave their sacred lands. The scene wasn't battle, it was slaughter. Every adult had been bound and killed. The earth was torn as if someone had been digging for something. And hidden beneath the ruins in a stone alcove lined with carvings and feathers, Silas found the boy alive, silent, staring. Barely 2 years old, he couldn't speak. But his eyes followed Silas with unnerving calm. Silas buried the dead beneath cairns of stone and took the child home. He and Miriam named him Elias and baptized him within the week. If he cried in strange tongues or flinched at clanging metal, they blamed trauma. But as he grew, it was clear Elias wasn't like other children. He sensed storms before clouds gathered, found lost tools without searching, and once led Miriam straight to a missing neighbor's child, deep in the forest. He rarely spoke, but when he did, adults fell silent. The older he got, the more the others avoided him. They said he heard things no one else could. Sometimes he'd stop mid-lesson, tilting his head as if listening to a whisper only he could hear. Miriam joked he was touched by spirits, but the truth would soon prove far darker. On February 18, 1883, the people of Briar Hollow packed into their cedar church, the stove glowing faintly, as Reverend Pike preached on the trials of Job. Snow blanketed the mountains outside. Inside, faith filled the air like heat. In the third pew sat Miriam Dorn, and beside her, Elias, silent and waiting for something only he seemed to know was coming. Silas stayed home that Sunday, his back stiff from days of chopping wood. But Miriam insisted their son should be among his community. She dressed Elias warmly and led him down the snow-packed trail to the chapel, though something in the boy's stillness unsettled her. He didn't fidget or whisper as other children did. His pale gray eyes were fixed on the altar as if seeing something far beyond it. Reverend Pike was midway through a sermon on divine justice when Elias rose to his feet. It wasn't the restless stir of a bored child. It was deliberate, almost ceremonial. The wooden pew creaked beneath him, and a sudden silence fell over the room. Every head turned as Elias stepped into the center aisle, his arms hanging loosely, his face blank but strangely calm. Then he spoke, his voice clear, yet not quite his own. The stone breathes beneath Marlow. The smoke will rise, and 27 will sink. But the crow has cried, and 19 shall walk free. When the sun stands highest on the third day, let no man dig. The mountain remembers. His words rolled through the chapel like a tide too measured to be random, too vivid to be dismissed. Then came stranger ones, Anawa Equizat. The bones hum in the dark places, the fire beneath the coal. Gasps rippled through the pews. Miriam reached for him, but he stepped back. Eyes unfocused, speaking again in that steady, distant tone. Tell them. Tell the men below. Do not wake the ones who sleep beneath the black vein. The mountain is hungry, and it remembers every hand that spilled blood where the spirits once danced. His final words came as a whisper, barely audible. Yet somehow, every soul in that room heard them. Debt paid in ash. Then he blinked as if waking from a dream and looked up at his mother. His voice, now the voice of a frightened 9-year-old, trembled. Mama, why is everyone looking at me? The silence that followed felt alive. Reverend Pike stood motionless, his sermon forgotten. At last, with shaking hands, he ended the service with a short prayer and sent everyone home. Outside, crows wheeled in the gray sky, their cries echoing over the snowbound valley. Inside, no one spoke of what they'd seen, not aloud. By nightfall, Briar Hollow was a divided town. Some believed Elias had been chosen a vessel of God's warning. Others whispered that evil had found a new disguise, the face of a child. In the Dorn cabin above the creek, Miriam sat by the fire, brushing Elias's hair while shadows passed by their window. Silas said nothing, though he kept his axe beside the door. Below, houses glowed with lamplight as neighbors argued scripture and superstition. And somewhere in the quiet, an old phrase returned to the surface. The old blood. By morning, 3 names carried weight. Gwendolyn Pike, the Reverend sister-in-law, and a woman of quiet conviction, told her prayer circle the boy was a prophet. Her son Arthur worked in the Marlow coalfields, and she couldn't ignore the warning. A child doesn't speak in riddles, she said, unless something older speaks through him. Reuben Cross. Briar Hollow's oldest resident and a former Marlow foreman had no patience for mysticism, but new minds. He said Elias's talk of fire beneath the coal wasn't poetry, it was danger. The lower chamber had been unstable for years. He'd warned the owners before, but they hadn't listened. And then there was Dr. Horace Bellamy, a newcomer brought by Reverend Pike to treat a fever outbreak. A tall man with sharp eyes and a notebook always in reach. Bellamy had seen seizures and delusions before, but nothing like Elias. The boy hadn't convulsed, hadn't babbled, his words were organized, intentional. That unsettled him most. When Bellamy asked to examine Elias, Miriam refused. That night she sat by her son's bed, watching as he tossed in uneasy dreams, whispering in a tongue older than English. By Monday, word had spread beyond the valley. A traveling merchant carried the story down to Marlow. In the chapel, Reverend Pike fasted and prayed for understanding. If Elias had been touched by God, then why had his words sounded so much like the language of the people Pike's own ancestors had driven from these hills? 3 days, that was the time Elias had given. When the sun stands highest on the 3rd day. In Briar Hollow, time was measured not by clocks, but by the shadows on the ridge, the color of the creek, the sound of the wind. And for 3 long days, nothing felt right. The air seemed charged heavy. On the first morning, Reuben Cross was already packing. He saddled his mare before dawn, a man who had seen too many cave-ins to gamble again. When his neighbor asked why, he said simply, "That boy don't know how to lie, not with eyes like his." Wendelin spent the day writing letters, one to her son in Marlow, another sealed and handed to Reverend Pike. "If I'm wrong," she said, "it's just paper. But if I'm right..." He didn't open it. Dr. Bellamy, still barred from the boy, watched from outside the Dorn cabin, noting every movement. Elias was restless, pacing with an odd rhythm, sometimes pausing to stare south toward Marlow. He'd hum low, tuneless sounds that made Bellamy's hair stand on end. Once the doctor swore, the boy smiled faintly, then shuddered as if the smile had belonged to someone else. In the homes scattered along the hollow, fear hung like fog. Fathers debated whether to go to work that week. And overhead, the crows kept circling as if waiting for something only they could sense. Mothers began pulling their children inside earlier each evening, bolting doors they'd never locked before, unable to name the fear pressing on their hearts. Kids whispered about Elias in hushed voices. Some called him the ghost boy. Others refused to even look his way. The chapel, once the heart of the community, grew uneasy. Half the pews sat empty. Those who came did so not for comfort, but for structure, to feel that something holy still held their world together. Meanwhile, Elias grew stranger. On Tuesday night, Miriam woke to find him barefoot in the snow behind their cabin, staring up at the moon. His gray eyes shimmered like glass. "It's loud," he murmured. "Down there. So many of them walking where they shouldn't." Miriam wrapped him in a blanket, her hands trembling as she led him inside. He didn't sleep that night. He whispered things that made her blood run cold, phrases she couldn't understand. "The crows have flown," he said once. "The door's already open." When she asked what he meant, he only replied, "They're going too deep. The stone doesn't like it. The fire is hungry." Wednesday, February 21st, 1883. The day the mountain answered. It began with silence, a strange heavy stillness that felt less like peace and more like a warning. The sky was cloudless, the sun sharp and golden on the snow. In the Dorn cabin, Elias sat by the window, motionless, his breath fogging the glass. He hadn't eaten or spoken, just watched. Across Briar Hollow, people moved slower than usual. Children stayed indoors. Men hesitated before splitting wood. Even the dogs lay low to the ground, as if sensing something in the air. Miriam kept glancing between the clock and her son. Each tick seemed to echo louder than the one before. Then at 11:40, Elias stood. "It's starting," he whispered. 20 miles south, deep beneath Marlow, the morning shift was in full swing. Over 100 men worked the tunnels, their picks clanging against rock, their lamps flickering in the dark. The newest section of the mine had been reopened just days earlier, promising rich veins of coal. Reuben Cross reached the site just after dawn, half frozen from his overnight ride. The foreman barely looked up until Reuben mentioned the boy's name, Elias Dorn. "He's the one they say speaks in riddles," the superintendent muttered. Reuben nodded. "He's the one who gave me the number 19. For once, luck or fear was on his side. 19 miners the crew assigned to the new tunnel were ordered topside just before noon. At exactly 12:16 p.m., the mountain split open with a sound that didn't belong to this world. It wasn't a rumble or a quake, but a cracking roar, deep and terrible, like the groan of something ancient waking from sleep. In Briar Hollow, dishes fell from shelves. Dogs barked. A chimney stone crashed into the snow near the chapel. Then came the rolling echo from the south, a thunder trapped underground. Inside the Dorn cabin, Elias closed his eyes. "The stone has taken them," he said quietly. 19 were spared. 27 now dream in the dark. His voice was steady human again, but Miriam swore she saw something fade behind his eyes, as though part of him had gone out like a candle. Hours later, a courier stumbled into town, his coat-torn face pale. He carried a telegram from Marlowe's superintendent and a note from Deputy Marshal Everett Connors. The southern tunnel had collapsed completely. 27 men dead, 19 saved just as the boy had said. That night, Briar Hollow didn't sleep. Prayers mixed with sobs, and Elias's name passed through the town like a fever. Some whispered it like a psalm, others like a curse. Because whatever had spoken through that child, it had spoken truth. To the outside world, the Marlowe collapse was another grim entry in a long history of mining tragedies. But in Briar Hollow, it was something else entirely. It was proof. And proof is a dangerous thing. By sunrise, news had spread beyond the valley. Traders, preachers, and newspaper men came calling, all asking about the boy who saw. Reverend Pike withdrew into the chapel fasting and praying. When he finally returned on Friday, his eyes were hollow. His sermon that day wasn't the fiery kind people expected. "The Lord speaks in ways we're not always ready to hear," he said softly. "And not everything that speaks comes from heaven." He never named Elias, but he didn't have to. Everyone knew. The Dorn family became the center of something they couldn't control. Silas, once the quiet backbone of the community, stopped speaking to anyone. He refused visitors and carried his axe even inside. Miriam tried to keep their days normal, but Elias had changed. He no longer hummed or paced or spoke of strange dreams. He simply sat by the fire, eyes fixed on the flames, as though waiting for something that wouldn't come back. When Miriam finally asked what he'd seen, Elias whispered, "I didn't want to know." But it came anyway. Dr. Bellamy, determined to understand, began documenting everything. The timing, the witnesses, the words. He begged to study Elias again, but Miriam refused. Silas warned him that if he came back, he'd leave in pieces. The town itself was unraveling. Some began leaving offerings outside the Dorn cabin, loaves of bread, carved figurines, scraps of wool. One woman knelt in the snow, begging the boy to pray for her son's safe return from Charleston. Others crossed themselves when they saw him. A few muttered darker things, that the prophecy hadn't been mercy, but a curse. That Elias hadn't saved those 19 men he'd chosen them. Elder Jonah Crane. A fierce voice from the chapel's inner circle had decided enough was enough. He started a petition demanding that Elias be removed from Briar Hollow altogether. Whether it's God or the devil, he said no child should hold that kind of power. Even those who believed in Elias's gift couldn't agree. Was he a messenger, a curse, or something in between? Through it all, the boy stayed silent, withdrawn and pale until the next Sunday, when he stood once again in the chapel and changed the town forever. February 25th, 1883, 1 week after the prophecy. The chapel was so crowded that mourning people spilled into the aisles, their breath fogging in the cold air. Some came to pray, others came to see. Most weren't sure which one they were anymore. Elias sat beside Miriam in the front pew, lost inside a coat several sizes too big. He looked smaller, dimmer, as if some inner light had burned low. Reverend Pike began to preach from 1 Samuel, the story of the boy prophet who heard God's voice in the night. But his voice cracked halfway through. Before he could finish, Elias stood. The room didn't fall silent this time, it froze. Every person seemed to stop breathing. Elias stepped into the aisle. No trance, no strange language, just the clear voice of a 9-year-old child saying things no one should have known. "Mrs. Karen Talbot," he said, turning toward the back pew, "you buried a bottle behind your smokehouse? You tell yourself it helps you sleep, but it's because the baby cries in your dreams." The woman gasped, her husband staring in confusion as she covered her mouth in shame. Elias turned again. "Mr. Hollis, the loan you gave the Bramble family wasn't charity. You charged interest and called it mercy. God hears every coin that clicks in your pocket." The murmurs began. People shifted away from those named as though guilt could spread by touch. Then Elias lifted his gaze to the pulpit. "Reverend Pike," he said evenly, "you lied about Charleston. There was no council meeting. You went to see your brother. You sat beside his bed and told him you didn't believe anymore." "Not really." The Reverend stumbled, pale and trembling, his faith cracking in front of his congregation. No one moved to help him, to help. Elias turned next to Dr. Bellamy. "You came to study me," he said quietly. "But you've studied others, the man in Charleston with the trembling hands, the girl who screamed after her brother drowned. You touched their minds and called it medicine. How many didn't wake up?" The doctor's face drained of color. He didn't answer because the boy was right. His work in Charleston had been secret, experimental, and one patient had died. Elias's voice softened. "I didn't ask to know," he whispered. "But now I can't unknow. Your secrets scratch at my bones like mice in the walls. They won't stop until they're spoken." He looked down at his hands, small and shaking. "I'm tired." Then he collapsed, not suddenly or violently, just folded in on himself like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Miriam screamed and rushed to him, Bellamy close behind. The boy's pulse was steady, his breathing even, but he wouldn't wake. His lips moved faintly, whispering to someone unseen. Outside, a slow, heavy snow began to fall, thick flakes that melted the moment they touched the ground. Inside, no one felt clean. In 5 minutes, the boy had stripped the town bare, not its walls, but its conscience. Within hours, Briar Hollow was unraveling. The chapel that had once united the valley now stood silent and dark. Reverend Pike locked himself inside for 3 days. Mrs. Talbot, the first named, packed her belongings and left before sunset, never once looking at her husband. Mr. Hollis raged and denied everything. But by week's end, 3 men came forward with proof of his deceit, and his shop closed its doors. Reverend Pike returned to the pulpit, a changed man. His sermons grew quiet, filled with uncertainty. He preached fewer scriptures and more questions, a man unsure whether he had served God all his life or had simply waited for him and heard him at last through a child. But it was Dr. Bellamy who faced the hardest truth. He spent that night alone reading through his old notes. When he reached the section labeled Charleston Patient 4, his hands began to shake. Elias had known the details. He'd hidden the experiment, the failure, the death. The boy hadn't accused him. He had revealed him. By Wednesday, Bellamy asked to see the Dorn family once more. Silas refused, but Miriam, ever merciful, allowed it. The doctor knelt beside the fire where Elias sat, drawn into himself. "I never meant harm," Bellamy said. "I only wanted to understand." Elias didn't look up. "Understanding didn't ask you to keep going," he said quietly. "You did that part on your own." The doctor wept, and for the first time in months, Briar Hollow went still, not peaceful, just empty. People avoided the chapel and one another. Marriages strained. The air no longer smelled of pine or smoke, but of something colder truth. And truth, as they learned, never settles easy. Children were kept indoors, doors stayed locked, and the gifts once left at the Dorn cabin disappeared. What replaced them were glances, some reverent, others afraid. But beneath all the fear, one question spread through the valley like frost. If the boy could see what was hidden in them, what else could he see next? After the second prophecy, Elias began to fade. His sleep grew restless, his strength thinned, and his hands trembled even when he tried to hold a spoon. Miriam cared for him endlessly, barely leaving his side. Silas said little, only repeating the same words over and over. "He's slipping." And Elias didn't argue. One night, as the firelight flickered against the cabin walls, he whispered to his mother, "Every time it happens, something stays behind, and something in me gets left out there." When she asked what he meant by out there, he only stared into the flames and said nothing. Dr. Horace Bellamy had come to Briar Hollow searching for reason. What he found instead was obsession. After Elias's second prophecy, the doctor made a quiet, terrible choice. If the boy's mind truly brushed something beyond human understanding, he would be the one to uncover it. He began visiting daily, always polite, always calm, pretending his concern was medical. Miriam, grateful at first for any help, allowed it. Elias trusted him, at least in the way children sometimes trust the few adults who don't flinch when the world turns strange around them. But soon Bellamy's questions sharpened. His visits turned into examinations. He brought brass-tipped rods, jars of oil, and a strange tuning fork that he struck near Elias's ear to test his reaction to sound. He called it neurological research. Elias endured it for days until he didn't. On the fifth day, when Bellamy reached for his wrist, Elias jerked away as if burned. "You're not looking for answers," he said quietly. "You're looking for control." Bellamy didn't deny it. "Do you know what you are, Elias?" he asked. The boy's gaze was steady. "I'm the door," he said. "You're the hand trying to pry it open." That night, Elias didn't sleep. He sat upright, rocking slightly, whispering in a language Miriam couldn't understand. His body was hot, though he had no fever. His heartbeat fluttered unevenly, his eyelids twitching as though trapped between waking and dreaming. Miriam begged Silas to stop the doctor from coming back. Silas agreed, but by then Bellamy had already gone too far. He had begun documenting everything: Elias's diet, his reactions to light and sound, even his breathing patterns. He was convinced the boy's visions were a form of trauma-induced overstimulation, a neurological response to loss and isolation. He recorded everything but the boy's slow decay. Then came March 2nd. Elias entered another trance, unprovoked, unprompted. But this time his words turned inward. "The fire is under my skin now," he murmured, "and the stone has memorized my name." Miriam knelt beside him, her heart hammering. "Elias, what do you see?" The boy lifted a trembling hand. "A white room, your voice but far away. I'm on a table. Something's inside my head." His voice deepened, smooth and calm, in a way that made the room colder. "Tell the doctor the choice is coming. He can keep digging. But if he goes further, he'll bury me. The mountain doesn't give second warnings." Then his body went limp. Miriam caught him before he struck the floor. That evening, Bellamy came pounding on their door, demanding to see the boy. Silas met him at the threshold, an axe resting on his shoulder. "You're the one he warned about," he said, and slammed the door. Bellamy stayed awake all night in his quarters, staring at his open journal. The boy's words haunted him. They weren't delusions. They were messages. And the next one, he knew, would demand a price. March 5th, 1883. The sun rose weak and pale behind low gray clouds. Even the crows had gone quiet. Inside the Dorn cabin, Elias lay still, his breathing shallow, his skin pale and wax-like. Miriam hadn't slept in days. She sat by his bedside, brushing his hair back with trembling hands. Reverend Pike came twice to pray, and on the second visit, he wept openly. Just before noon, Elias stirred. His fingers twitched, his lips moved. "The table is cold," he whispered. Miriam leaned closer. "What, sweetheart?" His eyes opened slightly, glassy distant. "He's standing over me," Elias said. "The straps are too tight. He wants to see what happens if he pushes deeper." Miriam froze. Elias's voice grew stronger. "There's a light above me." Something metal in his hand. He's whispering just a little further. Miriam shook him, desperate to break whatever held him, but his body was rigid. "The mountain is watching," he continued, "and it doesn't blink. It counts debts, it measures silence. It knows when mercy has been buried beneath curiosity." Then his voice shifted again, not louder, but older, colder. "Dr. Bellamy," it said. The air in the room seemed to still. "You wanted truth, but truth is not yours to hold. You thought the mind was clay, and this child a vessel. But the vessel cracks, and when it breaks, what leaks out will not be light." Silas entered, just as Elias's final words fell into the air. "The next push will be the last. Choose knowledge or mercy, because both cannot survive the night." Then his eyes closed and his body went limp. Silas looked at Miriam. "It's time." They didn't send for Bellamy, but the doctor came anyway, uninvited, just after sundown. His eyes were hollow, his journal clutched in one trembling hand. "He's sleeping," Miriam said, standing in the doorway. Bellamy nodded. "I need to see him." She shook her head. "You heard what he said?" Bellamy swallowed hard. "Yes," he whispered. "And he's right. I was willing to trade his soul for a page in a book." He stepped back, tears streaking his face. "Take care of him, if there's still something left to save." Then he turned and walked away into the snow. That night, for the first time in days, Elias slept peacefully. No murmurs, no movement, just breathing steady and quiet. 2 mornings later, Dr. Horace Bellamy left Briar Hollow before dawn. He left behind only his medical journal, a leather-bound record filled with half-scientific notes and frantic confessions. The final line read, "The mind of a child should never bear the weight of heaven or hell. I came seeking reason and left with only shame. Let no one follow me down this road." He never came back, and for the first time in months, Briar Hollow began to breathe again. The fear didn't vanish, it simply went quiet. Doors opened. Children played in the snow once more. The chapel remained mostly empty, but the townsfolk greeted one another again. It was enough. Elias recovered slowly. On the 3rd day after his collapse, he woke thinner, weaker, but present. Miriam wept with relief. Silas held him for a long time. The boy no longer hummed or stared into the corners of rooms, but he also no longer heard the voices, not the whispers, not the mountain. Whatever had spoken through him was gone. And at first, they feared the silence, because in Briar Hollow, silence was never just silence. But the silence didn't bring darkness. As winter melted into spring, Elias didn't just recover, he changed. He laughed again. He asked questions. He chased sticks across the thawing ground like any other boy. The deep crease that had lived between his brows since infancy faded, replaced by an easy calm that made even strangers stop and watch. Something inside him had burned out, yes, but what remained was peaceful, steady, and human. By the time the snow cleared from the ridgelines, Reverend Pike was preaching again. His sermons were shorter now, quieter. He no longer thundered about sin and punishment, but spoke of doubt, mercy, and the mystery of faith. People listened differently, as though they finally understood that not every truth comes wrapped in Scripture, that sometimes understanding lives in silence. Mrs. Talbot returned alone that spring, moving into her sister's spare room and tending the chapel garden. She never spoke of why she'd left or what had happened in Charleston. The townsfolk who once called Elias cursed now kept their distance, but in softer ways. Some dropped off bread or mended fences. Others simply nodded when they passed the Dorn cabin, too humbled or too ashamed to speak. Elias never entered another trance. The strange languages, the voices, the dreams, they all faded. But what replaced them was something else entirely. He began to sense the world differently. He could feel when a storm was building hours before the clouds gathered, or when the soil was too soft to plow. He guided travelers through fog by following the way birds moved across the trees. He listened to the earth the way a hunter listens for breath. He no longer spoke for the mountain, but he still knew when it stirred. He grew into a quiet young man. Not the strongest or most talkative, but people noticed the way he carried himself calm, certain, grounded. He had a gift not of prophecy, but of understanding. He could read the land like Scripture. He knew when a tree would fall before it leaned. He warned farmers of early frost, saved a herd before the first ice storm, and led more than one search party to a lost traveler without compass or lantern. Just instinct. Some called it luck. Others said the old magic never really left him. Elias never claimed either. Sometimes the mountain talks he'd say with a faint smile. You just have to listen without trying to understand. He never returned to the chapel pew where he'd once stood and spoken words that split the town in two, though he helped repair its roof after a storm. He never revisited the mining ridge where the mountain had collapsed, but he often walked its trails, hands in his pockets, listening. He became a surveyor and map maker, the best in the region. His maps were precise, his markings clean. But it was his way with the land that made him invaluable. He'd kneel, press his palm to the dirt, and say, "Don't dig here. There's water under it." And he'd be right every time. By 23, Elias had mapped every hill and valley within 30 miles of Briar Hollow. He married Lenora Pike, the Reverend's niece, a woman who had never looked at him with fear, even when others had whispered. They had 3 children, none of whom spoke in strange voices or dreamed in languages unknown. And maybe that was the truest mercy the mountain had ever given. Elias never spoke of his visions again. When asked, he'd just smile and say, that was another life. But one autumn evening, his youngest child asked why he always carried a small ridge stone in his coat pocket. Elias turned it over in his hand and said, "To remind me that some things don't speak in words. And just because it's quiet doesn't mean it's gone." When Miriam passed, he carved her headstone himself. No scripture, no verse, just her name and the outline of a crow's feather etched into the granite. 3 winters later, when Silas died, Elias buried him beside her. He didn't cry during the service, but afterward, he sat by their graves for hours as the snow gathered around him. When someone asked what he was doing, he said simply, "Listening." And no one questioned it. Time moved on. Buildings aged, families changed, and the world beyond Briar Hollow grew louder, faster, more restless. But within the hollow, something remained. The town never grew much, and it never needed to. Those who stayed did so not from fear of the world, but from respect for the quiet truth it had taught them, that not everything real can be explained. And though the events of 1883 faded from memory, they were never truly gone. The mountain still stood silent and patient, remembering every word that had ever been spoken in its shadow. They lived on in the small things, the quiet customs, the unspoken habits woven into everyday life. Parents taught their children to listen before they spoke. Travelers noticed that local maps still marked faint boundaries around Marlow, though the mine had long since been struck from official records. The old entrance was buried under thorns and brush, sealed by time and silence. No one ever tried to dig it open, not from fear, but from understanding. The people of Briar Hollow remembered the boy and the mountain that once answered back. Reverend Pike lived into his later years, his fire tempered into something gentler. His sermons grew less about certainty and more about mystery. Near the end of his life, he told his congregation, "I once believed revelation came with thunder. Now I know it comes in silence." He never confirmed or denied Elias's gift, but those who knew him said his prayers changed after 1883. He stopped asking for answers. He began asking for mercy. The children of Briar Hollow grew up beneath the weight of something unspoken. They played in the fields where prophecy had once echoed, carved their initials into fence posts Elias had built, and heard stories of the boy who saw. Some were told he was a prophet, others that he was cursed. Most just called him Elias, and that was enough. Because while the world beyond the mountains chased miracles that shouted, Briar Hollow had learned to honor the ones that whispered. Once a year, on the anniversary of the Marlow collapse, a few families would walk the ridge at noon. They didn't go to mourn or even to remember. They went to stand still to listen. Elias Dorn died in the winter of 1926. There was no headline, no spectacle, just a short notice in the town register. Elias Dorn, 52, mapmaker, beloved husband and father of 3, known for his kindness and his uncanny way of reading the hills. He passed peacefully in his sleep, one hand resting over his heart, the small ridge stone still tucked inside his coat pocket. They buried him beside Miriam and Silas, under a tree that hadn't bloomed in years, but did that spring. Lenora placed a simple marker at his grave. It read, He listened. No one spoke of prophecy at the funeral. But afterward, several of the older townsfolk walked to the southern ridge and stood facing the overgrown mouth of the Marlow mine. The air was still. The wind was soft. And though the mountain said nothing, it was listening. In the years that followed, Elias's story faded to something between legend and memory. Some said he'd been blessed, others that he'd been broken in a way that let him see what others couldn't. A few called him chosen. But the truth, the real truth, was stranger. Elias had seen people for what they were, not just the disasters waiting beneath their feet, but the quiet cracks inside their hearts. The guilt they buried, the lies they lived by, the debts they refused to pay. And he spoke them aloud, not to judge, not to wound, but because he couldn't help it. It wasn't a gift. It was a weight one he carried until there was nothing left of him but the quiet. Decades later, scholars came searching, historians, theologians, scientists, all chasing the mystery of the boy from Briar Hollow. They found fragments, a few journals, faded letters, and one surviving page from Dr. Horace Bellamy's old casebook preserved in a university archive. It read, What I saw in that child was not delusion. It was not divine. It was the human mind stretched to its fragile edge where memory, blood, and silence converge. The Marlow collapse remained one of the deadliest mining disasters in the state's history. 19 saved, 27 lost. The mine was never reopened, not because of danger, but because of reverence. Some places the people said, "Don't want to be disturbed again," and sometimes, if you're lucky, someone warns you before it's too late. So maybe the story of Elias Dorn was never really about prophecy. Maybe it was about listening to the world, to one another, to the parts of ourselves that whisper truths we'd rather not hear. Because sometimes the most haunting revelations don't come with thunder. They come softly in the voice of a child, wearing a small coat and pale eyes that have seen too much. And when they do, we can turn away, or we can listen.